Part 3. Fugitive. Chapter 5. Waghosha. Krellikar wakes suddenly, and though his bladder feels like it's about to burst, he remains flat on his back, perfectly still. A brutal upbringing of constant mortal testing has forced him to cultivate a stealthy existence. The clarity of his last dream fades quickly as he listens to his surroundings. He has no idea as to where he is, but the heat of the place is well beyond what should be considered acceptable. He opens his eyes slowly, feeling much heavier than he ordinarily does, his body drenched with sweat. Waghosha. He has to get off of this damned planet. Dusty rays of light stream lazily through clouded windows off to his sides. Shapes begin to make sense in his groggy mind. Huge structural roofing supports angle down just above him. Small puffy aves dart intermittently around him, accompanied by the soft, abrupt fluttering of wings. The stench of baked, rusted metal, old hot dust, layers of guano, decaying vegetation, and bitterly pungent amphibian body odor rises up to assail his enhanced sense of smell. Below him, the heavy sounds of Hethwuthu laborers symphonize into a rhythmic foundation for their end-of-the-shift vehicle inspections. The rumble of giant tractors powering down shakes him through to the bones. Ah, yes. Krellikar remembers. The equipment storage terminal for the industrial farm he'd landed in. The previous evening, after the sting of disappointment faded enough for self-preservation to replace grief as his primary motivation, Krellikar removed his EVA suit and stuffed it back into the escape pod. He withdrew all his gear, then programmed the small craft to coast at a leisurely pace toward the smoking ruins of Outer Basamarl, setting the pod's hover grid to maintain a low, ground-hugging altitude. For a few moments, he just stood there, sweat beaded on his forehead, watching the escape pod as it slowly glided away. The small craft seemed to grow smaller the further it drifted off. Fiddling absent-mindedly with the intricate control bracelet, Krellikar felt the diminished gnaw of his anguish begin to intensify. He mentally pushed his rising despair down into the bottom of his gut. His stomach tightened with an uneasy tingling in response, and gurgled angrily with the effort it took to subdue his emotions. Looking down with a grimace, he imagined the beginnings of an ulcer eating away at his insides right then and there. He would have loved to have used the escape pod to get further away from the war-torn city, but a sight like that would draw too much attention, and prudence governed his reasons still. In the midst of all the turmoil from the short-lived war, the arrival of ships from various NGOs, inspectors from the Allied Order of Nations, and in the confusion of every news network on the planet flocking to capitalize on the day's tragedy, Krellikar hoped his little escape pod would escape notice. At the very least, he hoped it wouldn't lead those looking for participant survivors of the war his way. To that end, before he secured the hatch, Krellikar crippled the small pod's navigational log and started an electrical fire in the passenger compartment to erase any evidence of his presence. The fire should also explain away the pod's errant behavior, and the fact that it flew over rather than rode on the ground should work against anyone curious enough to try to backtrack its route. At least he hoped it would. It was the best he could do on such short notice. He activated the mute suit function on his all-tech body form, turned, shouldered his backpack and his tool sack, checked his J99 sight, and reflexively patted at his hair. The EVA helmet had undoubtedly made him look a bit disheveled. Krellikar looked down at his phantom harness as it shuddered with warning and flipped up a small display. Its sync with the departing escape pod was rapidly deteriorating. Once the sync failed, Krellikar's biorhythms would no longer be masked by the little craft's systems, and very soon he'd be visible once again to scanning technology. The electrical fire he started in the small craft was dutifully serving its purpose. Krellikar wiped his brow and considered several possibilities. The most probable outcome was a scenario in which the escape pod malfunctioned and stalled long before it even made it to Outer Basamarl. The little engineer hefted his backpack into a higher, more secure fit. It was time to move. Exhaling a quick, bracing huff of air, he set off on foot to put more distance between himself and the sullied twins of tomorrow. thinking he'd have to find a local vehicle or perhaps an animal to ride away on. In this gravity, it wouldn't do to put too much strain on his power assist body frame, or on himself for that matter. And after the briefest of reflections, he decided it would be best to travel by vehicle whenever he found the opportunity. He didn't actually know how to ride any animals, but that was beside the point. The best way for him to proceed now was, as always, with caution. Getting as far away from Bossamar with all due haste was his most immediate concern. Having observed how Waghosha's allied Order of Nations operated during his short time on this planet, Krelakar was fairly certain that if he was ever captured, he'd be paraded around in front of all the cameras at Waghosha's World Court as an example of how aliens were not to behave. After all the pomp and pageantry of his trial, he'd be executed in the most painful way possible as retribution for the severity of his crimes. This probably meant he'd be subjected to a protracted drowning. He watched a recording of one once during his time in Bossamar, and for as familiar as he was with the engineering of methods to detain, maim, and/or kill, there was something about this particular Hethwuthu punishment that seemed unusually cruel. Maybe it was just that as an air breather, he knew it was a fate reserved specifically for him. Accompanied by this unpleasant train of thoughts, Krelakar walked for long hours in his modified discount power assist body frame. First, over hectares of freshly tilled land, then through field after densely planted field of Waghosha's towering perennial crops until he stumbled upon this storage terminal. He circled the isolated building while still in the fields, using the high agricultural growth as cover. At some distance from the facility, he found a buried data line near the side of a road by which he gained entry into the farm's surveillance systems. With precise timing, Krelakar transitioned the monitoring of his area in between the mechanical changing of camera angles over to the mundane events around a far-off equipment storage unit. Then, after syncing his phantom harness to the system, he rapidly detached his portable display and data worms, swiftly returned them to their proper places in his tool sack, convincingly reburied the uncovered data line, and raced over to the building's pedestrian access. Once there, he quickly bypassed the simple, powerless door locks without any observable damage, taking care to relock the door once he was inside. Having acquired shelter, he immediately began searching every corner of the terminal for a suitable hiding place and a well-deserved rest. He settled on a spot high in the structure. Based on his observations from the ground, he'd be all but invisible up there while resting above the facility's blinding industrial light fixtures. Confident with his plan and trusting in the habit that most land dwellers had in that they rarely looked up while in familiar places, especially when they were concerned with working the ground, Krelakar silently made his way up to and then around tightly clustered groups of tiny sleeping aves already nestled comfortably in the rafters. Once he found a suitable length of space on which to recline, he was able to relax enough to let his emotional and physical exhaustion pull him down into a deep, coma-like slumber. Finally, the last Hethwuthu laborer turns off the lights and closes the cargo door on his way out for the evening. Krelakar sits up, taps at his control bracelet to activate the Alltech body form's nano-scrubbing hygiene cycle, and checks his chronometer. Its sleep log displays a solid bar of unbroken unconsciousness for the little engineer for almost 20 hours. He hasn't needed more than 2.5 hours of sleep on any night following his first series of genetic alterations over 15 years ago. Krelakar absorbs his astonishment with a gentle nodding, in acceptance of the inordinate stress of yesterday's events. The muffled bang of a closing ground car door jerks his mind back to the business at hand. He checks the status of his mute suit and, satisfied with its continued operation, rolls forward to a knee to collect his things. His movements make less than a hint of a whisper of a sound. Several aves perched at a cautious distance away from the strange, noiseless giant hop away with uncertainty. Krelakar studies the tiny birds, his chin at an angle, eyes keen. After the briefest of moments, he disregards them as inconsequential, collects his gear, and scrambles down from the rafters like a spider racing towards suddenly entangled prey in its web. The successful execution of his newly evolved stratagem, a plan of action devised while listening to the Hethwuthu laborers finish their closing chores, requires celerity and unwavering focus. Upon reaching the ground, however, an abdominal cramp nearly doubles him over. Waste matter violently demands release from his throbbing bowels, reminding him of the consequences of sleeping for 20 hours straight. With a brief, aggrieved look at the terminal's exit, Krellikar submits to his body's needs and races in the opposite direction for the building's toilet. Several moments pass. Several loud motors come to life outside. Grolix! The little engineer spits the curse over his shoulder as he gives an anxious half-look toward the building's outer door. A few much longer moments later finds Krellikar hustling back toward the terminal's exit while resealing his all-tech body form to the sound of closing doors and engines revving from the terminal's parking lot. The physical sense of his relief, dwarfed by the immediacy of his plan, leaves only a faint tingling in his groin. And though his failure to follow his normal hygienic routine pulls at the back of his mind, he ignores the almost obsessive impulse to turn back for a proper washing. Speeding across the floor of the facility to the pedestrian entrance, Krellikar clambers up a barrel of fertilizer to peer through a window at the side of the door, eyes squinting in the dying light of Waghosha's second setting sun. Outside, the two remaining laborers bring their after-work chat to an end as they move toward the last two ground cars in the lot. The rest of their crew has already begun to drive away in their rumbling vehicles, eager to conclude the day in the most agreeable way possible. Slow-creeping dust clouds kick up in each car's wake. A rising particulate broom chokes the terminal's sun-baked parking lot. A downturned smile settles across the bottom of Krellikar's face. He gives the window a quick inspection to check it for any sophisticated locks or alarms. Finding none, he flips up the latch to disengage the frame, then pauses for an urgent consideration of its metal construction. It is old. Very old. Rusted. Misshapen. A drop of sweat falls from the tip of Krellikar's nose. He scratches at a soaked, irritated armpit. He tests the window with a slight push. It doesn't budge. This is not surprising. He looks at the door. It is possible the departing Hethwooth might not notice it open. If they are anything like normal beings after a long day of work, they'll be more concerned with looking forward to leaving than with looking back at their jobs. As if spurred to action by this thought, one of the two remaining laborers actuates the ignition on its ground car, a combustion engine, and a loud one. Gah! Krellikar yelps in alarm. To the void with the door. He leaps forward immediately, his modified nervous system allowing him to act in the smallest fraction of an instant after the sound of the newly rumbling motor hits his ears. He drives against the window with all his might. His power-assist body frame strains at the joints. The barrel of fertilizer wobbles up on its edge. The window frame screams monstrously on its hinges, but the sound is masked by the violent waking of the Hethwoo's vehicle. Krellikar congratulates himself on his timing. From what he can ascertain of their body language through the sooty, beclouded air, the laborers haven't appeared to notice his activities, and the window is open just enough now to let him slip through. Looking down, however, he realizes he won't be able to simply push the window closed once he's out, a substantial difference in heights being the issue. He thinks about jumping back up to try to close the window once he gets to the ground, but that would take too much time for even one try, and this window is so old and rusted, Krellikar doubts one try will do the trick. He exhales a quick, bracing huff of air and decides there is nothing to be done for it. He'll have to let them wonder who left the window open in the morning. The memory of father shakes its head with disapproval. Krellikar furrows his brow and bunches his lips in frustration, plagued by the relentless imperative to leave no trace of yourself. He rationalizes not finding a way to close the window by focusing on the haste demanded by his situation. Then he leaps down from the window before he argues himself into missing his ride. Falling terribly fast through the air, he strikes the ground with incredible force. Fiery needles of pain shoot through his feet and into his legs. A grunt full of that pain pushes up his throat to twist his face. Damning the giant planet in its high gravitational pull, Krellikar hobbles desperately through the dust-filled air toward the two vehicles. A second combustion motor roars to life. The two laborers yell their final farewells and slam the doors to their ground cars shut. Reddish-brown dust obscures all. Krellikar scampers over to the back of the closest ground car unnoticed. Its roofless flatbed trunk space gradually materializes through the red, gritty haze. The little engineer makes a short hop and grabs the top of the tailgate just as the driver guns the accelerator. The vehicle's rear tires spin madly in the dry terrain. Dust and dirt shoot into the air like thick jets of rusty steam. The ground car fishtails a bit, then speeds off under the command of its driver. Waghosha's best top 40 pop countdown blares out of the ground car's open windows. Krellicar is coated with ferrous grime. A petty galactic insult, the little trammeler muses, to add to the injury of his Waghoshan employment debacle. The ground car rumbles on along the road leading out of the industrial farmlands as the sinuous, dirt-covered human climbs undetected into the vehicle's flatbed and crawls under a length of stiff, soiled canvas beside a couple of narrow boards, some random bits of trash, a toolbox, and a coil of thick rope. As soon as he pulls the canvas over his head, the heat-magnified smell of its filth hits Krellicar like a brick in the gut. He gags painfully, struggles to keep as quiet as possible, and strains not to vomit in the oven-like heat under the foul, stiff canvas. Sweat floods through his pores. Frantically, he scrambles to the edge of the canvas to stick his face out into the chaotic winds whipping about the back of the flatbed. A deep inhale of the cooler, relatively cleaner air instantly soothes his condition, and Krellicar's entire body goes slack with relief. He gulps the air indulgently to regain his strength and his wits. An indeterminate amount of time passes. The ground car continues to rumble along without pause and with no sign of alarm from the driver due to Krellicar's unseemly olfactory crisis. The little engineer tests his constitution with a timid swallow. His throat feels thick and sluggish. The harsh pain and discomfort this action would have caused moments earlier is gone, but the sting of his lower digestive acids still lingers where he'd rather they wouldn't. Slow minutes pass, accompanied by the oppressive thump-thump of Waghosha's best top 40 pop countdown. A sudden caustic burp frees itself from Krellicar's relaxed innards. A wave of normalcy flows through the little trammeler in its aftermath, and a downturned grin crawls across his face. With his nausea now tamed and his stratagem successfully underway, his mind refocuses on planetary egress. He looks around the cluttered trunk space and allows himself to feel a small measure of joy at this modest achievement. Catching a ride is much more of a clandestine course of action than stealing one, though in either case, he reasons, getting caught would be disastrous. Doing his best to avoid notice, he crawls to the back of the cab and positions himself directly behind the driver's seat while remaining mostly under the canvas. He slowly raises his head until he can see just over the lip of the flatbed wall. From this position, he observes their course intently. For a short time, they follow a path roughly parallel to Basamarl, still visible on the horizon in the fading light of day. After breezing through a security checkpoint to exit the farm, the driver turns the ground car away from the war zone and speeds off down a nearly deserted 2-lane country road. Krellicar breathes a sigh of relief. Now, he thinks, for the complicated part, getting off of Waghosha. Unfortunately, everyone he knows capable of facilitating this goal is in Basamarl. No, Krellicar corrects himself, this was only true before the invasion. A few, he knows for certain, fled the region like he had in the days immediately preceding the war. The others who stayed, however, had more than likely gotten themselves killed in the conflict. Krellicar nods grimly to himself. Killed in the conflict or apprehended by the Allied Order of Nations in the blasted remains of central Basamarl. The little engineer shakes his head. Both decidedly undesirable fates. Krellicar has no intention of returning to the devastated city to search for any of them. In any case, he has to find another way. Using small movements, he slips his arms out of the shoulder straps to his backpack and slides it beneath his head to serve as a pillow. Then he pulls his tool sack close and opens it to retrieve his mini computer mat. He unrolls the device and lays it on the flatbed to boot up. After a second of thought, Krellicar moves immediately to disable its global positioning software. His mouth forms a string of silent curses as he expands the deactivation of GPS functionality to all his gear. This simple act of self-preservation is something he should have executed the moment he learned he was a fugitive. Yesterday, when he was still with the escape pod. Anxiety pulls at his chest. Though the industrial farm surveillance systems remain close enough for his phantom harness to maintain its electronic masking function, Krelikar's stomach grumbles with the fear of capture all the same. The little engineer turns back to the mini-computer mat. A few quick commands bring up a map of the continent of Imaron, the location of his current adversity. He studies the map as he contemplates his predicament. Attempting to strobe out-system through a planet-side gate would be an amateur's mistake. The Allied Order of Nations almost certainly has the biometrics of the war's participant survivors flagged by demons in the planetary system's PRF network. Sure, Krelikar purged his biofile of everything except his image from Waghosha's data stores, but again, practicality demands caution. Basamarl had impressive intelligence capabilities before the war, and as Krelikar had always been taught to overestimate an opponent, he can only assume the depth of the Allied Order of Nations' intelligence apparatus is equal to or greater than his patron states had been. Accordingly, it's impossible for him to be certain he purged enough of his biometric data to prevent being identified and strobed directly into Waghoshan custody. After a few more moments of study, he decides the best way to get off planet is to find a ship to stow away on. It's the most effective method of travel when one wants to slip off the grid, and the easiest place to find a ship, he reasons, is at a spaceport. The further away from Basamarl, the better. Port security is usually more lax with more distance from conflict zones. At least in Krelikar's experience, this has been the case. He hopes this time won't be an exception. Taking his eyes from the map, he cranes his neck to inspect the landscape as it rolls by. He knows approximately where he landed in the escape pod, and he knows his current heading is roughly east-northeast, away from the SGL industrial farm complex. But without any GPS software running, and without questioning his oblivious chauffeur, he has to find a landmark of some sort to help pinpoint his location. After comparing his surroundings with the map for about 5 minutes, the ground car passes an extensive wall constructed of alternating lengths of chain-link, corrugated metal sheets, and thick rusted posts on the south side of the road. Beyond this barricade lies a towering wasteland of discarded scrap. A junkyard. Krelikar translates this observation to his map to mark his position. Ah, there he is. The junkyard is enormous according to the map. Krelikar looks back up to compare the preloaded satellite image with what he can see from the ground. Endless mounds of trash go by on an otherwise flat countryside. It's a mesmerizing sight until the last of Waghosha's suns slips below the horizon. A short time passes, and the loudly off-key Top 40 singing Hethwu decelerates his ground car to coast into a solitary fueling station, Pazuksu's Gas and Go. A sign at the entrance to the station states, "Last stop for 294 kilometers." Krelikar turns away from the darkening sky. The sight of more and more stars makes him think of other worlds, which leads him to thoughts of his current predicament on this particular world. And thoughts of his current predicament on Waghosha only serve to remind him of how pointless all his efforts will be should he get caught. Consequently, it is with a sour disposition, while being jostled around on the cluttered flatbed, that he watches their approach to the fueling station through the windows at the back of the vehicle's extended cab. The Hethwu guides the ground car up to the side of a fuel pump and brakes to a hard stop. Krelikar slams into the back of the cab. A flare of irritation burns through his mind as he pulls his tool sack close and slides to his stomach to avoid notice. In the driver's seat, the Hethwu turns its head out of curiosity to see what banged into the back of its cab. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, the huge amphibian assigns the noise to the shifting of clutter, not worth another thought. It places the vehicle in park, settles the engine, and exits the ground car. A sudden concern stops the massive beast before it moves away. It throws a brief glance at the flatbed to check if the toolbox is open. Seeing that it isn't, the creature lumbers over to the small, standalone structure that serves as the fueling station's market. Krelikar rises to a hunched, kneeling position, pleased that he continues to remain undetected, and watches his oblivious chauffeur through the cab's back window until the Hethwu enters the fueling station's market. Once the amphibian passes through the door, Krellikar rolls up his mini-computer mat, returns it to his tool sack, and begins to rummage around. He has an idea.